Hi there, this is Chris Lucas. Dr. Barnes has asked me to talk to you about Richard Nixon because my dad, Ed Lucas, has been with the Yankees now for 65 years. He's a broadcaster, even though he's totally blind. His story is an amazing story on its own. But thanks to my dad and thanks to the Yankees, we had a close family relationship with President Nixon, who, by the way, was also a big Disney fan. So we'll get into that. But first, a little bit of history. So Mr. Nixon, when he was vice president of the United States of America, he was a big fan of baseball, fan of Disney, fan of all these things, but he ran against John F. Kennedy in 1960, and he lost a very close election. And once that election was over, he figured that his time in politics was done. So Mr. Nixon moved to New York City for a while. He opened up a law office on Fifth Avenue, and he used to go to Yankee games all the time. So he and my dad became very close at the Yankee games. They would sit together, they'd talk baseball, and they really got to know each other very well. So my dad, in the meantime, got married. He had my older brother who was born in 1967, and I was born in 1968. And remember, my dad is blind, so at the time, President Johnson was starting these great society laws, and one of them was that if you were handicapped, you could apply to buy a home, and the government would pay for 90% of the home, and you only had to pay for 10%. So it was a sweet deal, a terrific thing to do. And then Richard Nixon came back, an amazing comeback. He ran for president in 1968. He won, became president, was inaugurated in January of 1969. And that program that my dad had applied for, he was approved in October of 1968, so just a few months before I was born. And then when President Nixon came in, he was a Republican, Johnson was Democrat, and like all administrations do, they tried to roll back everything that had happened under the previous administration. So Richard Nixon canceled that program, but my dad had been approved in October. So he called the administration here in New Jersey, the Federal Administration Department that was running it, and he said, I my house, I just picked one and I need the money for it. And the man said, oh, no, Mr. Lucas, President Nixon has canceled all of those programs. And my dad said, well, I was approved for it back in October, so grandfathered in. And he said, no, that's not how it works. So my dad went back and forth with this guy for an hour, trying to explain to him that once you're approved, even if the president kills the program, you're supposed to get it. But the man would not hear any of it. So finally, my father, being so frustrated, said, all right, bottom line, what do I have to do to get this approved? What do I have to do to get my money? And the man very sarcastically said, oh, the only way you're getting your money, Mr. Lucas, is if I get a call from President Nixon himself in the next 5 minutes telling me you could have the money. And then he hung up on my father. So my father said, oh, okay. Picked up the phone, called the White House. The next morning, the doorbell rings about 7:30 a.m. My mother answers the door, and there's this guy from the federal office in Newark with a bouquet of flowers from my mother and begging, oh, I'm so sorry, Mr. Lucas. I didn't mean to offend you. I didn't know who you were. I'm very, very sorry. So it helps to have friends in high places. So I was very young. I don't remember all the events that happened with President Nixon and his resignation, all that. But then after he left the White House, he moved to California for a while. He stayed in seclusion there for a number of years. And then he came back to the East Coast. He lived in New Jersey. And he would go to Yankee games all the time. And again, he and my dad struck up that close friendship. And again, they would sit together. They'd watch the games. They'd talk baseball. But before the games, there was a dining room downstairs in Yankee Stadium, and it was a big table, and everybody would sit there that was there, for the press box for the game. So my dad had a place there, Yogi Berra, Phil Rizzuto, Mickey Mantle, all these great Yankees that would come back and broadcast games or just be there. And President Nixon was usually at that table. So when I was a little boy and my brother was young, we would be sitting at that table, and we'd be, listening to all these great conversations. I used to joke, and I still do it, it was like the couch on The Tonight Show, because you never know who was going to be sitting there. My favorite one was we were driving over to the stadium, and we were listening to Billy Joel on the radio. And that day in school, we had been talking about Watergate and President Nixon. And so we get to the table, and who's sitting there at the table but Billy Joel to the left of me and President Nixon a few seats over. So a very surreal experience. But one of those conversations, I was freshman in high school, so early 80s, and it was a Catholic school, and we had a bunch of nuns there, and one of the nuns, my history teacher, was a dyed-in-the-wool Republican. I mean, she loved everything about the Republican Party. She loved President Nixon, and so we had an assignment, and it was early, like September, October, and the assignment was that we had to talk to somebody about some event in history and how they responded to it, or how they lived through it. And the teacher was thinking maybe Grandpa fought in Anzio in World War II. We could talk to him about that, or Aunt Louise lived in Dallas during the Kennedy assassination. So President Nixon was at the table that night at dinner at Yankee Stadium, and he said, boys, what are you doing in school? That's my Nixon impersonation. And I told him, I said, well, the history teachers, and he said, this assignment, does it have to be oral? Or you're writing it? Is it in person? And I said, well, we can bring people in. He said, do you mind if I come in? I'd love to talk to the class about. And so I said, well, of course, you are history. You're the president of the United States. So I didn't tell anybody. I told the principal to clear it with her. And then that day, President Nixon showed up, my teacher's jaw dropped, and then all the other nuns, one by one, started coming into the room. And he stayed there for an hour to our class, and the first half hour, he talked a little bit about his life and about his presidency, and then the next half hour, he took questions from everyone. So after he left, my teacher took me aside, Sister Eileen, and she said, Christopher, I just want to tell you, you not only have passed freshman year history, you've also passed sophomore year, you've passed junior year, you've passed senior year, and if you want to go to college, I will write a letter to any college you want right now telling them to accept you. So it had its perks of getting to know him. But one of the main things about President Nixon, and I'm glad Dr. Barnes asked me to talk about him, is that, you read about these people in history and you see movies about them and you read books about them, but it's getting to know them as people. And I've been blessed to be able to do that at Yankee Stadium with all sorts of famous people. But with President Nixon, his human side, I never talked to him about politics. People would come over to the table all the time and he would brush them off when he didn't want to talk about politics. What he loved talking about was A, baseball, because we were at the stadium, but B, he loved Disney. I mean, he had so many events at Disneyland he was part of. He and Walt were very close friends. Their daughters socialized with each other. After Walt died and President Nixon was in office, he had a big day in the White House where he brought Lillian, Walt's wife, there, and they made a commemorative coin and they honored Walt. So even after Walt died, Nixon, his grandson, Christopher, same name as mine, same name as Walt's grandson, he used to take him to Epcot all the time. So I would sit and talk to President Nixon about Disney, about Epcot, about Disneyland, some of the memories, some of the funny stories, and he would open. I mean, it was one of the greatest conversations I ever had, aside from the fact that he was a U.S. president and all that, just talking to this man who was older than me, who was there when Disneyland had opened and was part of all that. And ironically, the thing I remember about him, which I'll never forget, I asked him once, I said, what is your favorite Disney movie of all time? And I was expecting an animated film, but he shocked me and surprised me. He said that, Christopher, I said, Pollyanna is by far the best Disney movie. He said, I told Walt that many times, love Pollyanna. And Pollyanna, out of all the movies you would think the President Nixon would have chosen. But he told me he loved Pollyanna because of the spirit that's in it of optimism and the time and place in America that Walt loved, that he remembered as a child. That's the time it takes place. So it's little things like that humanize people. Again, we see them in photos, we see them in pictures, we hear about them in classes like this, but I consider myself very blessed. I miss President Nixon every day. We saw him many, many times until I believe he died in the late 90s. So he was there every day at Yankees, or every game he could at the stadium. So a wonderful man, a wonderful person, and it's as close as I ever got to meeting Walt himself. So I'll take that. Someone who was close to Walt that I've got to know on a very close basis. So thank you so much, Dr. Barnes, for offering me this opportunity to talk to your students, and thank you all very much for watching. So enjoy the class and good luck.